Coralie Palmer is the chair of the Landscaping with Natives team and co-chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion committees for INPS and the INPS Central Chapter. She serves on the board of directors for the Indiana Wild and is the IWF representative and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion committee member for the newly formed Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance. She's a regular guest on the podcast series Horses for Future, communicating about sustainable land management. Originally from London, Coralie has also lived in India, Egypt, and Australia, and for the last 9 years has been thankful to call Indiana home. She has a bachelor's and master's degree in biological sciences from Oxford University with a focus on botany, zoology, and ecology, and a background in conservation, environmental education, and landscape design. Working for the Environmental Justice Foundation in London, she focused on wetland conservation, publishing research from Bangladesh and Vietnam. Since moving to Indiana, studying the native plants and ecology of the Midwest has become a passion for her. She loves spending time traveling with her husband and 3 boys, visiting national parks in the US, and her family home by the sea in Cornwall, England. And with that, I will pass it to you, Coralie, to talk to us about landscaping with native plants.
Thank you so much. So I'm just going to share my screen here with you. Okay, great, thank you. So yes, first of all, thank you so much for the introduction, Caroline, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you all. Just a brief overview of what I'll cover this evening. We're just going to start off with some background on why it's so important to landscape with native plants. So the importance of biodiversity and ecosystem function. Then just getting down to a few of the details and covering what the INPS Landscaping with Natives team have been doing. And then an exploration of some of the key concepts for maximizing the ecological value of your landscapes. So that is just an overview of what we'll be covering. So first up, why are native plants so important? Well, it really boils down to this key concept, biodiversity. So biodiversity is the variety of life in a given place, and there are 4 main ways that we use to measure it. There's species richness, which is really the main one that is used in kind of the primary measure. There's also genetic diversity, endemic species, and ecosystem diversity. But unfortunately, whichever one of these you consider, the situation with regards to biodiversity really isn't looking great. Research from a very broad geographic range and across different texts indicates a very clear trend. Biodiversity is in steep decline. So a global assessment published in 2019 found that biodiversity is declining faster than at any time in human history. And this assessment, which had more than 350 contributing authors and analyzed more than 15,000 scientific publications, as well as a large body of indigenous and local knowledge, covered all regions of the world. The assessment found that around 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction, many within decades, and that's more than ever before in human history. And as with climate change, humans are the main culprit. So the assessment also reported that the current rate of global species extinction tens to hundreds of times higher than the average over the last 10 million years, and very worryingly indeed, the rate is actually accelerating. Meanwhile, a 2020 report by the World Wide Fund for Nature found that global populations of mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and fish have suffered an average 2/3 decline in less than half a century, with an alarming average drop of 68% since 1970. For insects, abundance, biomass, species richness, and range size are all declining. The number of insects has been reduced about 45% since 1974, while reported rates of annual decline in abundance are estimated to be about 1 to 2%. And available evidence supports a tentative estimate of 10% of insect species being threatened with extinction. And insects are vital to life as we know it. They pollinate 90% of all flowering plants and are the primary means by which energy is transferred transferred from plants to most other animals in food webs. They also play major roles in the critical processes of decomposition and nutrient cycling. Here in the US, a 2019 assessment found staggering losses in the North American bird population, with an estimated net loss of 2.9 billion, that's billion with a B, breeding adults since 1970. Devastating losses were found among birds in every biome. More than 90% of those losses were from just 12 families, including sparrows, blackbirds, warblers, and finches. And these population losses included many widespread and common species that might be disproportionately influential components of food webs and ecosystem function. So these figures are all extremely concerning. So biodiversity is in decline, but what does it mean for us? And does it really matter? And the short answer is yes, it matters an awful lot. The loss of biodiversity affects all of us. So a reduction in genetic diversity affects species' potential for adaptation, ongoing evolution, and survival. And this is becoming even more critical as fragile populations face increased pressures from climate change and a loss of habitat through rapid development. Loss of individuals is in itself a tragedy, and loss of abundance of individuals can lead to species extinctions. Loss of each unique and intrinsically valuable species is, of course, irreparable. And then each species lost increases the risk of cascading effects, with the loss of interdependent species and the breakdown and loss of entire ecosystems. And that is really, really important. Because ecosystems and trophic interactions are incredibly complex. So we have limited understanding of even the most well-studied species interactions. And there are countless others that we really have little to no knowledge of at all. We just don't know where the breaking points for ecosystems are. So when we lose biodiversity, we destabilize these systems and we risk their collapse. And without functioning ecosystems, we lose the vital ecosystem services which support life, such as the provision of oxygen, food, and fresh water. So for many of us, the conservation of other species is in itself a strong enough argument for action. But even for those who perhaps aren't quite as concerned with the conservation of other species, we can look at it from a very anthropocentric view. So the loss of functioning ecosystems impacts not only our quality of life, but threatens the very existence of life on Earth. So we're completely dependent on ecosystem services provided by plants and animals, and biodiversity is critical for ensuring the stability of these ecosystems. And it's rather brilliantly, I think, put by E.O. Wilson when he states that if invertebrates were to disappear, he doubts that the human species could last more than a few months. So the conservation of biodiversity really is very critical. And this is where native plants come in, because native plant communities support a great deal more biodiversity than introduced plants. I'm sure many of you are likely familiar with Dr. Talamy's excellent work, and you'll know, as he explains it so well, that it's mainly due to specialized relationships that have evolved between plants and insects. It's driven largely by the evolution of plant defenses to herbivory and insect adaptations to these. Around 90% of insect herbivores are diet or host plant specialists, meaning that they can only live on plant or eat plants that they've developed their relationship with over evolutionary time. So while introduced plants can provide some ecosystem functions, there's almost always a loss in biodiversity when they're used in place of native plants. And again, for all of you who are familiar with Dr. Talamy's work, you'll know it's largely about the caterpillars. And figures from these two studies, on which Dr. Talamy was a co-author, really illustrate this clearly. So first one, the 2018 study, found that there were 68% fewer caterpillar species, 91% fewer caterpillars, and a 96% less caterpillar biomass in study areas with introduced plants compared to native hedgerows. Another study found that suburban yards dominated by introduced plants were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees compared to primarily native landscapes. And this is really where all of us come in. So in his wonderful half-Earth theory, E.O. Wilson, who's a bit of a hero, argues that time is running short and we need to act quickly to stabilize the biosphere. And he puts forward the argument that by setting aside half of the Earth, we could stabilize 80% of its species. And this is an amazing goal and something that we should be striving towards. So, however, achieving this, particularly with unpredictable and changing political will, can sometimes seem unattainable. And I'm just going to ask here, Caroline, I'm sorry, I've had something pop up. Are you still seeing my slides or are you seeing my screen itself?
No, we're seeing the slides.
We're seeing slides. Okay, it just came to my computer. Okay, thank you. So yes, achieving this can is particularly with unpredictable and changing political will can sometimes seem unattainable. So the brilliance of Dr. Talamir's approach and the Homegrown National Park idea is that it takes the teachings of Wilson and Aldo Leopold and looks at how we can achieve these goals within the constraints of the world we actually find ourselves in. And looking at the situation as it is today, where around 80% of the land in the US is under private ownership, Dr. Talamir doesn't diminish the critical role of public preserves, but he argues that on their own, they just won't be enough to sustain biodiversity. So he argues that we need to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. And in doing so, he really expands both the opportunity and the responsibility for this necessary task of restoring ecological function to land to all of us. And one of the main ways to do this is to use native plants in our landscaping. And what's so encouraging is that it empowers each of us and also kind of shrinks the problem to something that might be more manageable. And with so many environmental concerns worldwide and so many of our plant and animal populations declining and facing increasing threats, using our diverse native plants and landscaping really is a way we can actually make a difference. So hopefully you've decided to include native plants in your landscaping, but what's the best way to go about it? Well, hopefully one of your first stops will be the INPS website, which is excellently put together and maintained by Wendy Ford. And we have a really talented and exciting Landscaping with Natives team, and I know Bill Daniels and Mary Welts, I think, are both here, who are members of the team, and we're incredibly grateful to them for their work. And we are also partnering with the Indiana Wildlife Federation and building on the Homegrown National Park concept as a platform to provide really as accessible and comprehensive information as we can to help guide gardeners, HOA groups, municipal leaders, so that they can successfully incorporate native plants into the variety of urban, suburban, and rural landscapes. And we are currently in the process of developing some great material along this framework. Some is already online, other parts are currently being worked on and being added as they're produced. So do check back regularly. And I'll just talk you through the framework of what we're working on. So first of all, the science explained. So detailed scientific information on the native plants and why they're so important. And then a digital education series. And this is really the centerpiece of our project. It's a series of short videos, a kind of a big series of short videos guiding through the steps of why and how to use native plants in landscaping. So these will be available on our YouTube channel, and some already are, so please do go and check those. Wendy Ford has done an incredible job creating a lot of content, and Sarah Gray as well has been incredibly generous with her time and created some really excellent content. The species information, so we already have species pages for a lot of the native plants, and Wendy Ford again is going through and updating all of these for each Indiana native, and adding consideration of ecological value and landscaping and horticultural information and photos for ID and inspiration. The growing native plants from seed. So we have a wonderful comprehensive guide to propagating natives from seed, which has been excellently put together by Bill Daniels. This is a hugely valuable addition to the INPS website, and we're very grateful to Bill for his really great work initiating this and pulling it all together. We're planning to have garden designs up there, so sample garden plans for different conditions, plant combination ideas, and photos and video virtual tours of mature native plant gardens that you can use for inspiration and get some idea of what to expect a few years down the line if you're just starting a garden now. We're also working with community gardens, and we're working with some of the SWCDs and Purdue Extension and helping to provide technical assistance and information for community gardens, and specifically edible natives, native companion plants for vegetable gardens and native pollinator gardens, and advice on avoiding or reducing chemical use. So the team, we see this as an excellent way for us to address some of the diversity, equity, and inclusion goals of INPS and to reach a wider audience than we've traditionally been able to reach, and also to incorporate issues connected with food security into the native plant kind of realm. And respecting Indigenous knowledge, so we're looking to better understand the Indigenous ethnobotanical uses of native plants and plants that are important to Indigenous peoples. We're very excited to hopefully be working with the Ifield Museum on this, and we'll hopefully be able to update you shortly with some more information on that collaboration. We're working on some material for HOA boards, so providing content and hopefully a video presentation that residents will be able to present to the HOA boards, along with sample letters and newsletter content, just to make that transition to native planting a little easier. For municipalities and municipal leaders, we're producing resources, plus advice on ordinances and legislative changes that can reduce environmental impacts of municipal areas. And then answers to common questions. Mary Durkin, one of our team members, is doing some great work pulling together some FAQs to address common problems and obstacles. And then availability and economics. So how and why to buy native plants, how and where to buy native plants, including information on financial resources and grants that are available. And we're very lucky to have the Buy Indiana Natives program as part of the INPS website, and Heidi Gray is chairing that initiative. So we're excited to be able to incorporate that. And all of this material will be freely available to use and share. So if there's any questions or feedback will be gladly received. So we're really excited to be developing this, and just to reiterate, it is truly a group effort, and we welcome all of your expertise and input. So if you have any feedback, or if there's anything on there that you'd like to be involved with at all, please do reach out. We would welcome any input at all. And so there is a lot of information that we have either got available or we are bringing together. But I realize it can sometimes be a little daunting to know where best to start or how to process all that information. So I'm just going to briefly run through some of the main considerations and key concepts that can really help increase the ecological value of your landscape and your native plantings. So number one, first step in the preparation, one of the really critical first steps is to identify and remove any invasive species. And you certainly want to remove any species listed in the Indiana Terrestrial Plant Rule, and ideally also any species designated as invasive by the Invasive Plant Advisory Committee. And there's a wonderful guide, the Pocket Guide to Regulated Plants, which has photos and descriptions to identify the plants and information on how to tell them apart from similar looking natives. And you can download a PDF of that from the INPS website. There's also wonderful information through the Indiana Invasives Initiative and the local SISMAs. And I think for many people here, that might be MC Iris, which has a great deal of really excellent information on their website. And INPS also has some great information. And I think Mary Welts is scheduled to talk to you next month, which I am looking forward to, as she has wonderfully comprehensive knowledge of invasive plants. So looking forward to that. And then the next consideration is really the area that you can plant in and add native plants to. So Dr. Talamy in the Homegrown National Park Call to Action is aiming for 20 million acres of native planting in the US. It's the largest cooperative conservation project ever conceived or attempted, and it represents the area of approximately half of the green lawns of privately owned properties in the US. So if you are able to reduce your lawn, which is an area that's really ecologically not very valuable, by any amount, that's wonderful. Whether you're able to fully cut it in half or just extend your planted areas by a few feet, any amount can make a difference. And there are also lawn alternatives, and one of our team, Maureen Brown, has been conducting some exciting experiments with sedges as replacement for turf grass. So this is something that we're excited to be able to share hopefully soon. And then in my own garden, my sweet dog Ivy is an excellent digger, so she's been very enthusiastic to help us with our lawn replacement project. And then the next big consideration, once you've cleared your invasives and you hopefully increased your area, is what to plant. And species selection really can make a very big difference to the ecological value of your plantings. So recent research indicates that just a few genera are really critical for local ecosystems, going above and beyond in terms of ecological productivity. So this one particular 2020 study used a data set that included over 12,000 Lepidoptera species, 2,079 native plant genera, and over 24,000 different host plant Lepidoptera interactions from across the United States. And the authors, which included Dr. Talamy, found that while the number and identity of keystone genera did vary with region, the overall pattern did not. And the overall pattern across the entire US showed that just 14% of the local plant genera supported more than 90% of Lepidoptera diversity. Moreover, the difference between the productivity of these genera and other genera is huge. So keystone genera supported orders of magnitude more Lepidoptera species than the majority of other local plants. Using simulations, this study found that restored Lepidoptera and interaction diversity could be nearly doubled by the presence of just a few productive taxa for both woody and herbaceous plants. So for example, when 20 woody plants are chosen randomly, just 38% of Lepidoptera and 13% of interactions are supported. While when half of the selected species are keystone plants, 71% of Lepidoptera and 40% of interactions are supported. And these differences were even more pronounced for simulations with herbaceous plants. With the inclusion of 10 keystone species, the percentage of Lepidoptera species supported increased from 13% with no keystone species to 42%, while potential interactions increased from 2% to 10%. So those are really considerable differences. So this research really indicates that not all native plants are equivalent in terms of their contributions to energy flow through food webs or their supportive interaction diversity. So planting these keystone native plants will have a disproportionately large impact on restoring biodiversity through the trophic levels and will help create the most productive landscapes possible. Ideally, plants from these keystone genera will be the backbone of your plantings. And so this is in 84% of counties in North America, oak was the most powerful to plant. And there were 10 genera that were identified as outliers due to their disproportionately high values relative to the mean across all county networks that were analyzed. So this list here, you've got the oaks, willows, the cherries, plums, and peaches, then the pines, and populus, which is poplars, aspens, and cottonwoods, betula, which is birch, vaccinium, which is cranberry and blueberry, then hickory, maples, and then apples and crab apples. So those 10 genera were hugely, hugely valuable. And helpfully, there is an excellent plant finder tool that was developed by the National Wildlife Federation in collaboration with Dr. Talamy. And you can put your zip code and search for the highest value genera to Lepidoptera in your area. So the results of that tool rank the top genera into each category. So you have flowers and grasses, and then trees and shrubs. And that's done by your zip code. And that is, I will send all of the links that I mentioned to Carolyn if you're interested, but that is nwf.org/native plant finder. And so for my zip code in central Indiana, the top 5 herbaceous plants come out as solidago, or the goldenrods, helianthus, the sunflowers, Fragaria, strawberry, eupatorium, so the bonesets and joe pye weeds, and viola, the violets. So those keystone plants support very high numbers of Lepidoptera and so species richness throughout the trophic levels. But the intention isn't to limit or restrict your plantings to just these. Ideally, you want to increase plant diversity overall with the intentional inclusion of those keystone plants. And then really the next consideration, I think, is looking at what best supports some of our other insects, including pollinators. And I find it easiest to break this down into 2 areas. So firstly, there are those plants that support specialists, and planting for specialists can greatly increase the biodiversity supported by the habitat, as both specialists and generalists can use them. So many of our native bees specialize on a particular plant family or genus when gathering pollen. Less commonly, some appear to specialize on a single species. There's a little passion flower bee that is reliant on Passiflora lutea, but more commonly it's to the family or genus level. So including plants from the genera that typically support the most specialists, together with the greatest diversity of native plants, particularly at the family or genus level, is a really strong strategy for trying to increase the ecological value of your landscape. And Heather Home calls these plants that really play an important role in providing food, shelter, and nesting sites the powerhouse plants. And she has excellent free downloadable resources and plant lists on her website, which is pollinatorsnativeplants.com. And that's particularly useful for, she has excellent information for native bees and wasps. So for example, mountain mint, the Pycnanthemum genus, is extremely valuable nectar plant, and she reports that 95 species of wasps and 42 genera use this. It's a top wasp plant and also supports cookie bees. While, for example, the monadas don't come up on the top tier for Lepidoptera, but they're very important for providing stem nesting habitat for some native bee species. And then the Xerxes Society also provide great information on endangered pollinators and on planting for pollinators. And then the second big consideration for pollinators is really flowering phenology. So ensuring that you're planting so that you have successional blooming period and floral resources for as long a season as you possibly can, from early spring through late fall. And in the spring in particular, this can be some of the woody species, like this redbud. And we're really lucky here in Indiana to have some of the few remaining populations of rusty patch bumblebees. And so considering floral resources that will support these populations, particularly early in the spring, is really important. So that's kind of a summary. So including keystone plants is critical for increasing the ecological value of plantings, including plants that support high numbers of Lepidoptera and those that support specialist pollinators is also really key. Additionally, those that either have a long bloom time or provide floral resources, particularly early or late in the season, and those that provide nesting and sheltering sites can be of very high value. And then you want to look at the list of genera that you've got and add in as much diversity as you can, particularly at the family level and genus level if possible, as this really increases the potential support for as many specialists as possible. And it might have quite a significant positive impact on some of the populations that specialize on the less commonly used plants. So including as many of these as possible is great, but if you are limited and only able to plant a few things, I like to cross-reference the results, as there are some plants that overlap and fulfill a number of these functions. So for example, and again, much of this is taken from Heather Holmes' excellent research. The willows, so various species have different flowering phenologies and can help with providing a continuous season of bloom. The pollen has a very high protein content, so it's very nutritious. Plus, it is one of the keystone species for supporting Lepidoptera. and keystone genera rather, for supporting Lepidoptera, supporting 289 species in central Indiana. The sunflowers, Helianthus, is another genus that really ticks all the boxes. It supports 69 species of Lepidoptera in central Indiana, and a very high number of specialist species also. And like all flowers in the aster family, the disc florets provide nectar for a long period. And then the goldenrods, or Sardago, that genus supports 110 species of Lepidoptera in central Indiana, and has stems that provide very valuable nesting habitat for native bees. So those tools and guidelines can give you a great idea of which genera and families you want to include. And so then I find a good next step is then to work out which species within those genera are native to your area. And there are a couple of really great tools to do this. And we are very excited, particularly, that the collaboration between INPS and the Indiana Wildlife Federation has produced this this new and I think really truly excellent local plant finder tool. So it was made possible thanks to the work of Ellen Jacquard and Wendy Ford, who over the years have developed such a comprehensive database of information and very generously shared this data with IWF. And IWF were able to utilize a donation for the rebuild of their website recently. And as part of that, we're able to combine the expertise of their web designer, John Onion, and the work of Erin Stump, who's the Habitat Program Manager, together with the data from Ellen and Wendy. And they've been able to build this excellent plant finder tool. And so photos are still being added, but you can currently search by light and water conditions, color, bloom time, pollinators, and plant height. And I think it's an excellent addition, and I believe one of the only plant finder tools currently available that combines both ecological data with landscaping information. So particularly when you're choosing factors such as continuous bloom period, this tool is incredibly useful. Excuse me, I'm just gonna have a drink. So, and wonderfully for us here in Indiana, all of the species in this tool are native to Indiana, and so no cross-referencing with maps is required, which is quite a nice bonus. And then this plant finder tool is highlighted as a major resource on the Homegrown National Park website, which is great exposure for INPS. The other great resource, if you want to look at the county level, is the Biota of North America program. And their North American Plant Atlas gives county level species maps. So these are very comprehensive. You can search by genus and see all the species in that genus that are native to your county. So, excuse me. So this is a really detailed resource for those who want to delve just a little bit deeper. And then it's also a consideration to prioritize some of the less common species or those that are of conservation concern in Indiana. And the DNR has a fantastic fantastic list of those species. So these considerations and resources can really help guide you to the species that will make the biggest impact. And then the excellent resources on the INPS landscaping website will hopefully be able to help guide you match these species with your site conditions and with your landscaping goals. So where possible, echoing native plant communities. So assessing what plant community on your property or area resembles. So woodland or water's edge or prairie, together with the conditions such as their soil conditions and light and moisture levels, is an excellent approach. And we have some great resources that list species that would be found in natural communities in various conditions on the website. For other areas of your landscaping, form or habit might be higher in your list of priorities, or functions such as screening biohedge or a rain garden. And we are gathering and will be putting online more information and videos on these topics and on landscape design principles such as using design tools such as distinct edges for a cared look, or larger groups and impact for structure, or repeating patterns and color considerations. So Sarah Gray is scheduled to talk to the INPS Central Chapter on April 29th, which is giving a landscaping 101, and we're really excited to hear that. And I believe that will also be up on our YouTube channel shortly afterwards. We're also really interested to try and incorporate the latest scientific research into the planting plans and ideas wherever possible. So, for example, a University of Kentucky study found that the layout of gardens really strongly influences the extent to which milkweed plants are found and used by monarchs. The study found that monarch eggs and larvae were more abundant in experimental gardens where milkweed was evenly spaced in a corridor around the perimeter, rather than when they were intermixed with other plants. And additionally, that they found more eggs and larvae in monarch way station gardens where the milkweeds were spatially isolated as opposed to mixed with other non-host plants. And also they were more abundant in gardens having north-south access unimpeded by structures. So hopefully if we can incorporate results of these and other studies into our landscaping decisions, we can really maximize our contribution to conservation. The question of, do you have to have entirely native plants, or can you have introduced plants as well? So certainly you don't want to have any plants that are invasive. And the best way to ensure that we don't have any that might become invasive is to use natives. But no, you don't have to have only native plants. The research does suggest that at a minimum, you really want at least 70% native plants. 70% of plant biomass seems to be a threshold level below which the probability of sustaining some local bird populations plummets to pretty much zero. So more than 70% native plants by biomass is really your target. And then another and possibly more controversial in some circles consideration is the use of cultivars or nativars. So I believe strongly that wherever possible, due to differences in their impacts on ecosystem services and biodiversity and gene flow, straight native species really are a safer option than the more widely available nativars. So variation in how the nativars are produced and the traits selected for make this a slightly complicated issue, but as a general rule from an ecological perspective, straight native species really are safer and preferable. So while nativars might be more attractive for some gardeners for aesthetic reasons, they can have ecological costs. Many of them have been selected primarily for ornamental traits, and research indicates that not all nativars are ecologically equivalent substitutions for their native species. So the ecological roles can be altered by selection for flower size, flower abundance, color, shape, or phenology, and that can affect the quantity, quality, and accessibility of pollen and nectar. And with double or sterile flowers, pollen and nectar may be absent altogether. Also, selection for traits such as leaf color can alter plant chemistry, potentially making the plant unrecognizable as a host or deterring herbivory. And then even where the trait being selected for might not appear to us to be ecologically significant, we are still learning about the cues that might be important for wildlife. For example, a June 2020 paper indicates that hummingbirds can discriminate various non-spectral colors, including UV, and that these are very likely vital in foraging. Also, hybridization may uncouple trait combinations that influence pollinator foraging. So even where we don't think we're changing anything important, we might be, and we don't know for sure yet. And then there's the potential for genetic pollution and the issue of the lack of genetic variation. And for fragile native plant populations, both of these are a real concern. So unintended hybridization can lead to gene flow from nativars into wild populations, as well as affecting ecosystem services. This can affect native population survival. And where native bars have been selected for vigor, hybridization is also concerning and may affect competitive interactions and community structure. Also, many native bars are propagated clonally and so have no genetic variation, and genetic diversity within native plant populations is critical for their adaptability and ongoing evolution. So open pollinated or seed grown selections of nativars are preferable to nativars that have been produced vegetatively, but information on nativar provenance is not always easily available. So I know it's not necessarily a popular opinion, and there are exceptions, such as where nativars have been selected for disease resistance, such as dogwood anthracnose. But from an ecological viewpoint, straight native species really are the safer option. And another aspect that really should be carefully considered is the provenance of seed and plants used. So neonicotinoids are particularly prevalent and concerning, and residue levels on ornamental plants have been found to far exceed lethal concentrations for honeybees and bumblebees. While research also indicates that they can lead to changes in foraging behavior, reduce predator avoidance, delay development, and reduce reproduction in bees, even at very low residue levels. They're systemic, and so they can impact other benign and beneficial impacts, and then have impacts through the trophic levels. In a 2017 study, researchers found that methoxam dramatically reduced egg laying by queen bumblebees. They found that they were 26% less likely to lay eggs after being exposed to this neonic. And then because they're absorbed into the plant, they can be present in pollen and nectar, making those toxic to pollinators that feed on them. And potentially long-lasting presence means that it's possible for them to harm pollinators even when the initial application was made months prior to the bloom time. So wherever possible, source seeds and plants that have not been treated with neonics. Also, I would really encourage you to use your buying power to help influence the supply chain. Asking in local garden centres and bigger box stores for natives and asking about neonics and provenance can really help to influence the buying practices. So please do ask, do bring it up. And then the next big consideration is really ecological landscape management. So you've put your native plants in and you've chosen them very carefully, and then how you manage them can have a huge impact on their value to the ecosystem. So there are some really easy things that you can do to ensure that your landscape maintenance is more sustainable. For example, you can wait as long as possible in the spring to do your first mowing, and that can help to avoid killing the caterpillars and other overwintering creatures that are just emerging or have yet to emerge. So set mow heights as high as possible and no lower than 3 inches, and avoid mowing in the evenings. This will help reduce wildlife mortality. Also changing to less frequent mowing regimes and leaving no mow zones. And then when you are mowing a patch of lawn, if you start in the middle and move out, it gives the wildlife a chance to escape rather than starting on the outside and moving in. And even setting the mower or other power tools going and just leaving them in the area for just a few minutes. You don't want to have too much unnecessary fumes, but just for a few minutes to give warning and time for wildlife to flee. And then with overwintering plants, leaving plants intact over winter is a very valuable practice. And then the excellent advice from Heather Home is in spring to cut back at various heights, kind of 6, 12, and 24 inches, and do that at varying times. Because as you do that, you're creating sites for the bees to move into as they emerge from the ground. And some of these bees come out of hibernation quite late. So do some at the end of April or early May, so you're creating habitat for these bees too. And then just leave them. The stems that you leave for nest should be left up all the way through the year and not be removed until late the following spring. And then creating caterpillar pupation sites. I think the figure is more than 90% of caterpillars do not pupate on their host plants. Most drop to the ground and find pupation sites in leaf litter or under the soil. So leaving the leaves under your trees with ground cover, planting them with ground cover and leaving them with fallen leaf cover, and where possible fallen logs also can really make a difference. And fallen leaves provide a wonderful overwintering habitat, as well as providing excellent mulch. And there is excellent information on that on the Xerxes Society have a Leave the Leaves campaign with a lot of super information there. And then the next big factor is lighting. So one of the biggest sources of insect decline is light pollution. So just simple changes using yellow LED bulbs, turning lights off or using motion sensors, using shades that can direct the light down. Those all can make enormous differences and reduce moth mortality in particular. And other very small steps, but they can make quite a big difference, are installing window well covers and to prevent small creatures from becoming trapped, installing water features with bubblers, and rather than using the larger bee hotels, which can lead to predation and some disease, using either smaller bee houses or ideally leaving logs and stems in situ. And then last, but very definitely not least in ecological landscape management, is avoiding, or at very least reducing, chemical use, and particularly pesticide use. So this in itself is a very big topic and one I won't go into in a great deal of detail, but there are a few very key points. So pesticide use is really contrary to everything else we're trying to achieve, and certainly any prophylactic use should be avoided. And please consider alternative methods if you are considering using pesticides. We talked a bit about neonics, which are particularly concerning, but also pyrethroid pesticides, which are widely used in mosquito control, are a real concern. So mosquito fogging kills insects indiscriminately, and the pyrethroid pesticides typically used are highly toxic or can be highly toxic to bees. So research indicates also that they may have some toxic effects in humans. And a safer, cheaper, and more effective alternative, Dr. Talmy advocates the use of mosquito dunks. Another option, if you don't want to use anything like that at all, is just to try and dispose of even small amounts of standing water on your property. And additionally, native planting around pond edges provides habitat for natural predators of mosquitoes and mosquito larvae, such as dragonflies and damselflies, and greatly helps reduce mosquito populations. Also, if you're considering using pesticides, remember that evidence of herbivory actually indicates that a plant is contributing to the ecosystem and should be welcomed. It doesn't necessarily indicate the need for insecticide use. So in a stable ecosystem with sufficient biodiversity, insect levels are kept largely in check by natural predators and parasitoids, including many of the birds that we like to see. Also, alternatives to pesticides such as companion planting and physical removal of non-native insects can be really effective. And then it's also worth noting that pesticide syndrome can occur with pesticide use. So this is where unnecessary pesticide use can lead to pesticide resistance and the elimination of natural predators, leading to a cycle of increased need and reliance on pesticides, which can be even more damaging. So there are really lots of reasons not to use pesticides at all. And then with fertilizers, it's also worth knowing that it's really unnecessary in areas of native planting, and high nitrogen soils might actually favor non-native and invasive species. And given the pollution associated with fertilizer runoff into waterways, fertilizers really should be avoided as much as possible. Also, that's another good reason for having native plants around your waterways. And the combination of that plus their contribution to mosquito control and goose deterrent means planting native plants around waterways really can be extremely valuable. And then finally, just a last kind of parting thought is to maybe consider starting the conversation about who a garden is really for. And perhaps we need a big cultural shift in our thinking about gardening, so that as a society, we see gardens not just for people, where their primary focus is on aesthetics or fashion, but we consider them more in terms of ecosystem function. And the key will be to try to make this way of gardening part of our culture, and to try and make it as acceptable to people who view gardens in a very different light. And to try and make native plants and functioning ecosystems as something that people can see as a thing of beauty, which they certainly can be. And hopefully our landscapes can be beautiful, functioning, living ecosystems that contribute to the well-being of all the life that shares them. So thank you. I am stopping my screen share now. And
Thank you so much. I appreciate that very much. I'm sure we all do. You have time for some questions if anybody wants to add to the discussion?
yeah, absolutely.
Be a little slow to get going, maybe. So, Mary had put something in the chat earlier about this year trying to help the brood 10 nymphs make their way to the soil so that they can come out again in the next 17 years.
That would be great. Yeah.
Giving them an opportunity to make their way.
That's a great thing to bring up. I'm excited to. I've never been in Indiana for that before. So I've never. Yeah, we don't have them in England. So this is an exciting experience, and yeah, that's certainly a great something that we should consider giving people advice.
Magical.
I have a question. If can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So I do native landscaping. It's my business, and typically I'm preaching to the choir because the people who come to me for landscaping already generally have a pretty good sense of why they want natives. But occasionally I do need to talk to people about these issues, and I'm just wondering what your most effective lines are for sort of weaning people from conventional aesthetics, conventional thinking that's sort of oblivious to the difference between natives and non-natives, or just really prioritizes a certain more conventional aesthetic.
Yeah, that's certainly a challenge. So the things that I found most successful are things like focusing on things like the butterflies. So nobody really likes the caterpillars. Not nobody, I like them. But if it's coming from a more conventional, perhaps viewpoint, a lot of people don't really enjoy caterpillars eating, but a lot of people are excited about the butterflies and pollinators on their plants, and just the really enormous value of native plants to those. Also, in my own neighborhood, that we've been transitioning to native planting, and with that, there were people on our HOA group who were not necessarily encouraging that, but looking at the financial aspect can sometimes speak to people who don't have who don't have such who maybe aren't as interested in the conservation value, the large financial savings that can come with a native plant garden. And there's a neighborhood in Fishers that did and I can get you the details. I believe there's something up on the INPS website about it. And when they analyzed the figures, I believe they saved about $60,000 over, I think it was a 12-year period, by transitioning to native plants and reducing, maintenance costs and fertilizer use and things like that. So that can be, one of those two can sometimes work. And then, and actually, I think this is where Sarah Gray's talk next week will hopefully be very helpful, and we'll be putting that on our YouTube channel, trying to cater to some of the more traditional aesthetic, but using native plants. So having them in with a neat edge, or incorporating some of the more traditional landscape design principles, but just using native species to achieve that look can be really effective too. So yeah, it is a challenge, and something that that we're looking at ways to to come to face.
Thank you.
This is it.
Thanks.
Anyone else? So I guess we'll wrap up with that. And as Coralie mentioned, she will send some documentation for me in case anyone wants references or citations of some of the studies that she mentioned, or anything else. And I'll be happy to provide that to anyone who's interested in getting those details later. So thank you all for joining us this evening, and thank you very much, Coralie, for presenting to us.
Yeah, thanks, Coralie.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Wonderful. And thank you. We will be posting this on the YouTube channel so that if you missed anything or you want to hear something again, then you can access it there in the coming days.
All right. Thanks so much for having me. Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you, and have a good night, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Night.
Night.